You are settling in now, perhaps with the world dimming around you, the air still and quiet, your mind ready to drift toward the kind of story that is not only history, but confession. My voice reaches you across years, steady and low, inviting you into the shadows of a life that was both brilliant and deeply flawed. I was born not into wealth, not into glamour, but into a small house in Yorba Linda, California, a place where dust clung to your boots and every coin was stretched until it cried. When people think of presidents, they imagine fine beginnings, dynasties, silver spoons. But I came from struggle, from a family where loss arrived early and often, where each day was a battle against poverty and illness, and where ambition was not a dream, but a necessity to survive. My earliest memory is not of joy, but of toil. My father was a stern man, his hands rough with labor, his eyes carrying the weight of disappointments he never put into words. He ran a small grocery store, and I spent my youth stocking shelves, pumping gas, watching the endless churn of faces that came and went. Customers paid late, if at all, and debts piled high. I learned the sting of rejection not from political defeat, but from the sight of creditors banging at our door, from the quiet despair etched into my parents' faces when bills could not be met. There was no softness in those years, no ease. Every small victory felt like borrowed air. My mother, though, was a quiet tower of strength. A Quaker woman, devout, unyielding, she believed in simplicity, in honesty, in the hard edge of virtue. She prayed more than she smiled. But when she looked at me, there was a tenderness that softened even the sharpest corners of our struggles. She buried 2 of my brothers before their lives could bloom. One taken by tuberculosis, another by illness too cruel for a child. Death was not an abstraction in our house, it was a constant visitor, sitting silently at our table, reminding me that life could be cut short without warning. Perhaps that is why ambition sank its hooks into me so early, because I knew the fragility of existence, and I needed to leave a mark that death could not erase. School became my sanctuary. I was not the most charming boy, not the most popular, but I was relentless. Books were weapons, knowledge my armor. I studied late into the night, determined to prove that I could climb beyond the reach of my small town. Yet even as I excelled, a certain hunger gnawed at me, the hunger for recognition, for approval that never seemed to come. My father rarely praised, my peers often overlooked me, and each success felt fragile, as though it could vanish if I stopped striving. This yearning, this ache to be noticed, would follow me all my life, pushing me higher, but also driving me into the very paranoia that would one day consume me. There is a story I often recall. Walking the dusty roads of Yorba Linda, shoes worn thin, watching trains pass in the distance, their whistles echoing with promises of places I had never seen. I imagined myself on those trains, leaving behind the smallness of my world, stepping into something larger. But then I would look down at my hands, cracked from work, at my clothes, patched and plain, and I would feel the sting of reality. I was not destined for easy greatness. If I wanted it, I would have to seize it, fight for it, claw my way through barriers built for men richer, smoother, better connected than me. My mother insisted I join the Quaker Church, that I carry with me the values of restraint and humility. Outwardly, I honored her wishes. I sat in silence at meetings, listening for the inward light, practicing the calm composure that Quakers believed revealed the divine. Inwardly, though, I simmered with restlessness. Humility was a virtue, yes, but ambition burned brighter in me than humility could contain. I wanted not just to live righteously, but to matter, to rise, to etch my name in the stones of history. Even as a boy, I could feel the contradiction taking root. The Quaker restraint on one hand, the fiery need to prove myself on the other. That conflict would shape me, divide me, and in time destroy me. When I was accepted to Duke University's law school, it felt like a door cracked open into a new world. I left behind the grocer's store, the gas pumps, the endless debts, and stepped into an environment filled with men who carried themselves with the assurance of privilege. They wore fine clothes, spoke with ease, moved through life as though destiny itself had been promised to them. I, by contrast, arrived with little money, hand-me-down suits, and a chip on my shoulder large enough to crush me if I let it. They underestimated me, laughed at me, dismissed me. That dismissal fueled me like oxygen feeds flame. I buried myself in books, outworked them, outlasted them, and though they continued to sneer, I knew that one day they would remember the name they had once mocked. Yet even in my victories, I felt the sting of being an outsider. I was not invited to their clubs, not welcomed into their circles of influence. I learned then the power of resentment, how it can be sharpened into drive, how it can push you further than privilege ever could. Resentment became both my shield and my curse. It carried me forward, but it also made me see enemies where perhaps none existed, turned whispers into threats, shadows into conspiracies. That paranoia, born in those early years of being overlooked, would never leave me. The war came, and like so many men of my generation, I entered the service. I was not on the front lines, not in the heat of battle, but in the Navy's logistics, handling contracts and supplies in the Pacific. It was not glamorous work, not the kind of duty that earned medals or headlines, but it exposed me to the machinery of war, to the grind of bureaucracy, to the quiet but essential roles that kept the great engine of the military turning. I learned discipline there, patience, the art of detail, and I learned that sometimes survival depended not on heroics, but on endurance. That lesson would echo years later, when endurance became my only weapon against waves of political storms. After the war, I returned home restless, determined to seize the momentum that victory had given America. The nation was changing, power shifting, ideologies clashing, a new world order taking shape. I saw an opening, a path that could lead me from obscurity to influence. Politics, it was a realm as brutal as war, though fought with words instead of bullets, with whispers instead of bombs. I entered it not because it promised ease, but because it promised relevance. The chance to be more than just another lawyer in another small town. When I first campaigned for Congress, I carried with me the same hunger that had driven me since childhood. I shook hands until my palms burned, gave speeches until my throat ached, smiled until my jaw locked. I painted myself as the soldier returned, the son of hardship, the man who understood the struggles of ordinary Americans. And it worked. People believed in me, or at least in the image I projected. I won. I had stepped onto the path I had long dreamed of. But with victory came a new kind of weight. The knowledge that from now on every step forward would demand sacrifices, compromises, betrayals both small and large. Looking back on those early years, I can see how the seeds of everything to come were already there. The poverty that gave me drive, but also bitterness. The Quaker upbringing that taught me restraint, but left me restless. The law school years that honed my mind, but deepened my resentment. The war service that taught me endurance, but left me longing for recognition. Each piece of my life fit together into a pattern that would one day carry me to the presidency, and then cast me down into disgrace. But in those early moments, I did not see the fall. I saw only the climb, the ladder stretching upward, and I believed, with all the stubbornness I had, that I was destined to reach the top. And yet, as I tell you this now, in the quiet of the night, I admit something I never admitted then. I was always afraid. Afraid of failure, afraid of being forgotten, afraid that all my striving would end in nothing. Fear is a powerful engine. It pushes you, but it also poisons you. It made me relentless, but it also made me suspicious, unable to trust, unable to rest. That fear became my companion, whispering in my ear, shaping every decision, even in these earliest years. What came after, the victories, the defeats, the triumphs of foreign policy, the disasters of Watergate, all of it was rooted in this beginning. A boy from Yorba Linda, poor, overlooked, yearning to matter. A boy who grew into a man who would grasp power with both hands and never loosen his grip until the world itself pried it away. And so as you drift further into this story, I invite you to stay with me. For what comes next is not the legend, not the caricature of a president brought down in scandal, but the intimate path of a man whose brilliance and paranoia walked hand in hand. You will see victories that reshaped the world, decisions that redefined nations, and shadows that grew darker with each passing year. But here, in the beginning, it is simply a boy staring at trains, dreaming of escape, determined to climb higher than anyone believed he could. The years after the war felt like a door had opened, but only a crack. I stood at the threshold, restless, hungry, and uncertain whether the world would let me through. America was changing, reshaping itself after victory, and in that shifting landscape, I saw an opening. Politics. The very word carried a charge for me, like the low hum of electricity beneath my skin. It was a stage, a contest, a place where words could wound as deeply as weapons, and where recognition was finally within reach. I had spent my life in the shadows of others, overlooked, underestimated. Now I wanted to step into the light to prove that a grocer's son from Yorba Linda could rise as high as anyone. When I campaigned for Congress in 1946, I threw myself into the fight with the same relentless energy I had carried through every hardship. My district was working class, scarred by the Depression, full of men and women who wanted someone who spoke their language. I went door to door, shaking hands until my palms were raw, listening to their stories, promising them that I understood what it meant to struggle. My opponent was a war hero too, Helen Gahagan Douglas, already admired, already connected. They called her the Pink Lady, whispered about her sympathies, painted her as soft on communism. I knew those whispers could be turned into weapons. I did not hesitate. Communism was the shadow that loomed largest over America then, a fear that crept into homes and headlines. I leaned into that fear, sharpened it into a blade and wielded it without apology. I painted myself as the defender, the soldier returned, the man who would stand firm against the red tide. My opponent said I was ruthless, that I smeared her unfairly. But I believed, or told myself I believed, that the stakes justified the means. It was not simply an election. It was survival, mine and the nation's. And so when I won, I felt vindicated. Not just victorious, but righteous, as though the rough path of my life had prepared me for this role. The fighter, the survivor, the man who would not be ignored. Those early victories carried me further than I could have dreamed. I found myself drawn quickly into the center of power, a young congressman with a reputation for toughness. The House Un-American Activities Committee gave me a platform, and I seized it. The Alger Hiss case became my crucible. A former State Department official, urbane, polished, everything I was not, accused of being a Soviet spy. The establishment dismissed the charges, called them absurd, but I pressed forward. I pursued him with the determination of a man who had been underestimated his whole life. My instincts told me he was lying, and when the evidence began to align, when the whispers of guilt hardened into proof, my name rose. Overnight, I was no longer just a grocer's son with a seat in Congress. I was the man who had exposed treachery, the relentless investigator who had pulled back the mask of betrayal. The newspapers began to speak my name with admiration, and with it came the first real taste of power. Yet admiration was never enough for me. I wanted more. Each headline faded too quickly, each victory left me hollow, as though I had only just begun to climb and could not stop. In private, I felt the same gnawing hunger that had haunted me since boyhood. I wanted to be seen, remembered, respected, feared. The Hiss case gave me a weaponized reputation, a fighter against communism, a man who could not be fooled. But it also gave me something else, enemies. For every supporter who cheered my name, there were others who spat it with contempt, branding me a hatchet man, a smear artist, a political animal without conscience. I pretended their contempt did not matter, but in the silence of the night, it echoed. I stored it away, a ledger of grievances, a catalogue of those who doubted me. Resentment was fuel, and I hoarded it carefully, knowing it would drive me forward when the path grew difficult. If people thought I was ruthless, perhaps they were right, but what they did not see was that ruthlessness was born of necessity, of a lifetime of being overlooked and pushed aside. If I struck hard, it was because I had learned early that gentleness left you forgotten. My rise did not stop there. By 1950, I aimed higher, seeking a Senate seat. Again, I fought with the same relentlessness, again wielding the fear of communism as my blade. Douglas was once more my opponent, and once more I pressed the attack. They called it the Pink Lady campaign, remembered it as brutal, but I told myself I was fighting not just her, but the tide of an ideology that threatened everything America stood for. When I won, I stood taller, prouder, convinced that I had earned my place among the men who shaped the world. But politics is not only about victory, it is about perception. And already I could sense the whispers gathering, shaping a caricature of me. Tricky, conniving, a man who played too close to the edge. Tricky Dick, they called me, and though I laughed it off in public, inside it stung like a lash. I told myself I would prove them wrong, that my brilliance would eclipse their insults, that my victories would silence their laughter. Yet the truth is, their contempt burrowed deep, feeding the paranoia that would one day devour me. In those years I worked tirelessly, rarely resting, rarely letting down my guard. My family paid the price. My wife, Pat, stood by me with grace and endurance, though the long campaigns, the endless travel, the ceaseless battles wore her down. I told myself it was all for us, for our daughters, for the future I was building, but I knew deep inside that it was also for me, for the insatiable hunger that no victory could satisfy. By 1952, my name had risen far enough that I was chosen as Dwight Eisenhower's running mate. I was 39 years old, a man who had clawed his way from the grocer's store to the national stage. Yet even then, suspicion clung to me. Accusations arose about a fund, contributions made to support my political expenses. The whispers grew into headlines, the headlines into a storm. My enemies saw an opening ready to drag me down. I could feel the familiar weight of contempt pressing against me, threatening to undo everything I had built. So I turned to the only weapon I had ever truly trusted: words. I went on television, looked into the camera, and bared myself to the American people. I spoke of my modest life, my debts, my wife's respectable Republican cloth coat, and of one small gift we had received, a dog named Checkers, which we intended to keep. It was a gamble, a performance, but it worked. Letters poured in, voices rose in support, and suddenly the storm passed. I had not only survived, I had grown stronger. Eisenhower kept me, the people rallied to me, and my reputation as a fighter deepened. That night after the broadcast, I sat alone and reflected. I had once again turned accusation into triumph, suspicion into strength. But I also knew that I had revealed something deeper, that my survival depended on constant vigilance, that every victory would be followed by new enemies, new doubts. The cycle would never end. It had begun in childhood, in poverty and loss, and now it followed me into the halls of power. I could not escape it. I could only use it, let it drive me, let it sharpen me. Looking back now, I can see the pattern forming clearly. The underdog clawing his way up, forever underestimated, forever doubted, forever hungry. It made me relentless, yes, but it also made me brittle, consumed by the need to watch every shadow, to guard against every whisper. Those traits would carry me to the vice presidency, to the edge of the presidency itself. But they would also plant the seeds of my undoing, long before I realized how deeply they had taken root. Even in victory, I could not rest, for I knew that behind every cheer there was a murmur of doubt, behind every smile a sneer waiting to appear. I told myself it did not matter, that what mattered was power, achievement, the climb itself. But in the stillness of the night, I felt it, the fear, the paranoia, the certainty that they were waiting for me to stumble. And so I resolved, as I had since boyhood, that I would never give them that satisfaction. I would fight, I would endure, I would rise, whatever the cost. I remember the day I was told I would be Dwight Eisenhower's running mate. I was only 39, still young enough to feel the hunger gnawing at me with every sunrise. To stand beside Ike, a man the nation adored, the general who had led us to victory in Europe, was both an honor and a burden. His presence was effortless, his reputation untouchable. I, by contrast, had carved my way forward with words sharp as knives, with tactics that earned me both victory and suspicion. Standing beside him, I was reminded again of that old familiar sensation, admiration mixed with dismissal, applause mixed with sneers. I threw myself into the campaign, certain I could prove myself worthy. But soon the whispers began, growing into accusations that threatened to destroy me. They said I had a secret fund, that donors had given me money for personal use. It was not true in the way they painted it, but truth in politics is often less important than perception. I felt the old bitterness rise in me, the sting of being marked, branded once again as dishonest, tricky Dick. The storm gathered fast, and suddenly my place on the ticket was in question. That night, I sat before the cameras and opened myself to the nation. The words I spoke came not only from calculation, but from the deepest chambers of my life. I told them about my modest means, about Pat's simple cloth coat, about the dog our daughters loved, Checkers, which we would not give up no matter what critics said. It was a performance, yes, but it was also truth. I had nothing but my work, my family, my determination, and somehow the people believed me. Letters poured in, telegrams stacked high, voices rose not against me, but for me. I had turned humiliation into triumph, suspicion into survival. Eisenhower kept me on the ticket, and the people rallied behind us. Yet even as I smiled for the cameras, I felt the echo of the insult in my bones. I had survived, but at what cost? The Checkers speech made me famous, but it also made me vulnerable. I was no longer just a politician. I was a caricature, a man who had bared himself to the world in desperation. I hated that vulnerability, even as I embraced the victory it brought. I told myself it was worth it, that survival was all that mattered. But in the quiet hours, I replayed the accusations, the smirks of my opponents, the sense that no matter how high I climbed, they would always find a way to pull me down. As vice president, I served faithfully. Eisenhower was a towering figure, and I became his shadow, his soldier, the man who carried out tasks he preferred to avoid. I traveled the world, meeting leaders, debating communists, standing in kitchens in Moscow, trading words with Khrushchev as cameras flashed. Those moments thrilled me, the chance to prove that I was more than the boy from Yorba Linda, more than the hatchet man. I felt the energy of statesmanship, the intoxicating sense that I could shape not just policies but history itself. But Eisenhower's approval was never warm, never easy. He was a general accustomed to command, and he saw me as useful, not indispensable. He praised me when he had to, dismissed me when he chose. Once, when asked about my contributions, he paused, hesitated, said he would have to think of something. That pause haunted me, the implication that even after years of loyalty, after tireless service, I was still forgettable, replaceable. It was a wound I carried silently, a confirmation of the fear that had followed me all my life, that I would always be the man overlooked, the man underestimated. I worked harder, traveled farther, spoke louder. I took on the tasks no one else wanted, the fights others avoided. I debated, I argued, I battled communists on their own ground, determined to prove I was not merely Eisenhower's understudy, but a man of consequence in my own right. Yet the sneers persisted. To some, I was ambitious to the point of desperation. To others, I was ruthless, willing to say anything, do anything to win. They watched me with suspicion, and I watched them with equal suspicion in return. Trust became scarce. Every smile looked to me like a mask hiding a dagger. Still, I dreamed. The presidency was always in the distance, shimmering like a prize that both beckoned and taunted me. I told myself that patience would bring it closer, that loyalty to Eisenhower would pave the way, that my time would come. But with each year the hunger grew sharper. I wanted more than the scraps of acknowledgement, more than the faint praise of a general reluctant to share the stage. I wanted to step out of the shadow, to command the light myself. When Eisenhower's second term drew to a close, I felt the opening at last. 1960, my chance. I had served, I had traveled, I had fought. I was ready to claim the role I had prepared for all my life. But even then, even as I stood on the brink of history, I felt the familiar tension, the certainty that they were watching, waiting, eager for me to fail. And in that year, with the cameras glaring and the nation divided, their chance came. I would face a man unlike any I had ever faced before. Youthful, charismatic, elegant, everything I was not. He would become both my rival and my mirror, a reminder that no matter how hard I fought, there were battles charm could win that sheer willpower could not. And in the heat of that campaign, under the relentless eye of television, I would taste not only the bitterness of defeat, but the raw humiliation of being measured against an image I could never match. But that is another chapter. For now, I remember the vice presidency not with triumph, but with a kind of aching frustration. I had served, I had endured, I had proven myself again and again, and yet, in the eyes of many, I was still Tricky Dick, still the ambitious climber, still the man who could never quite escape the shadow of doubt. The hunger burned hotter, the paranoia sharper, the need for recognition more desperate. And as I moved toward the campaign of 1960, I carried all of it with me, every slight, every wound, every whisper. They would not forget me. I would make certain of it. I can still feel the heat of the lights from that first debate in 1960, the cameras staring, the nation watching, the weight of expectation pressing down on me like a stone. I had prepared, studied, memorized every policy, every statistic. I was the seasoned man, the one who had traveled the world, debated communists, advised a president. My opponent was young, polished, charming, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. He stood there with his tanned face, his calm voice, his smile that seemed carved for the camera. I told myself that substance would prevail over style, that experience would matter more than image. But when the red light on that camera blinked alive, I knew I had underestimated something I could not control. I was still recovering from illness, pale, weary, my suit hanging loose. I refused makeup, thought it beneath me. Kennedy, by contrast, looked vigorous, confident, at ease. When I spoke, my words were sound, reasoned, grounded. But the television audience saw more than words. They saw the sheen of sweat on my face, the shadows of fatigue, the tightness around my eyes. To those who listened on radio, I had won. To those who watched on screen, Kennedy had triumphed. And in a world where image was becoming power, that distinction proved fatal. The campaign dragged me across the country, city to city, rally to rally, my body aching, my spirit fraying. Crowds cheered, yes, but always there was the comparison, the contrast between my doggedness and his glamour. I shook hands until my skin cracked, delivered speeches until my voice rasped. I told myself I could outwork him, that sheer endurance would carry me through. But endurance was not enough. He had something I did not, an aura, a myth already forming, a sense of destiny that made people lean closer, listen harder, believe deeper. I could not fight myth with statistics. When the votes were counted, the margin was razor thin. I told myself that fraud in certain states had tipped the balance, that corruption had stolen what was rightfully mine. Perhaps it had, perhaps not. But the truth is simpler. I had lost. The dream that had driven me from childhood, the climb that had consumed me, ended in that single word. Lost. I forced a smile, conceded with dignity, but inside, I burned. The bitterness was unlike anything I had felt before, a raw wound that refused to heal. I had been so close, so very close, only to have it ripped from me by a man whose charm eclipsed my effort. 2 years later, the wound still fresh, I sought redemption in California. Governor, a chance to reclaim momentum, to prove that I was not finished. I campaigned hard, fought with the same relentlessness that had carried me from obscurity to the Senate. But the tide was against me. The press circled like vultures, the whispers grew louder, the smirks sharper. On election night, when defeat came again, the humiliation cut deeper than before. Not only had I lost, I had done so publicly, painfully, my failures broadcast for all to see. The next day I stood before reporters, bitterness dripping from every word. I told them they would not have Nixon to kick around anymore. It was part defiance, part confession. I was tired of the sneers, the caricatures, the endless suspicion. I wanted them to know I was walking away, that I would no longer feed their mockery with my presence. Yet even as I spoke, even as I vowed to disappear, I knew in my heart it was a lie. I could not walk away. I could not surrender the dream that had defined me. But at that moment, in the stillness that followed, I felt utterly alone. The crowds gone, the cameras fading, the nation turning its attention elsewhere. I had been at the edge of history, my hand almost on the highest prize, and now I stood in the shadows again, forgotten, overlooked. The same boy from Yorba Linda, dismissed, unwanted. The hunger was still there, but it was buried beneath layers of shame, of anger, of wounds that bled in silence. I retreated, licked my wounds, tried to convince myself that life beyond politics was possible. I practiced law, gave lectures, moved in circles far from the blaze of power, but at night in the quiet I would remember the debates, the crowds, the closeness of it all. The White House I had almost entered, the dream I had almost grasped, and the bitterness would rise again, hot and relentless. They thought I was finished. They thought I was beaten. But I knew myself. I had endured poverty, ridicule, defeat. I would endure this too. And when the time was right, I would return. Stronger, harder, hungrier than ever before. In those years of exile, I carried my resentment like a secret fire. Outwardly, I was calm, reserved, patient. Inwardly, I was plotting, waiting, nursing the wounds until they became fuel. I knew the nation would one day tire of glamour, tire of myths, tire of the polished smiles. They would want steadiness, toughness, a man who had been bruised, but not broken. And when that day came, I would be ready. The dream was not dead. It had only gone underground, waiting to rise again. Defeat had not ended me. It had reshaped me, hardened me, stripped away the illusions and left only resolve. I told myself that the next time I would not falter. I would not allow image to defeat substance. I would seize the prize, and no one, no journalist, no opponent, no myth, would take it from me again. And so I waited. The grocer's son turned statesman, turned exile, turned survivor once more. Waiting, watching, biding my time, knowing that history was not done with me, that I would return. And when I did, the world would not forget my name again. The Oval Office was more than a room. It was a crucible. Every decision I made reverberated across the world, every word weighed by allies and enemies alike. From the moment I sat behind that desk, I knew that foreign policy would be my stage, the place where I could shape not only the destiny of my nation, but the balance of the entire world. Domestic battles consumed presidents, but foreign policy could elevate them to history. I had studied it all my life, obsessed over strategies, rivalries, the long arc of power. Now, at last, I could act. Vietnam was the wound that would not heal, the war that divided families, poisoned politics, and stained every conversation. I had promised peace, but not surrender. Peace with honor. I repeated the phrase until it became almost a prayer. Behind closed doors, I searched for a path that would bring American boys home while still preserving the credibility of our commitments abroad. The generals urged escalation, the doves demanded withdrawal, and every day more names were carved into the granite of memory. I carried those names in silence, knowing that each belonged to a son, a brother, a husband who would never return. I pursued a strategy not of victory but of endurance. Vietnamization, they called it, handing the war back to the South Vietnamese, training them to fight their own battle while our troops stepped back. It was a slow bleed, not the clean cut the nation demanded. Critics mocked me, protesters screamed, mothers held up photographs of their lost children. I listened, but I did not bend. History, I believed, would judge endurance more kindly than surrender. At night, when the shouts of demonstrators echoed outside the White House gates, I told myself that one day the truth would be clear, that I had ended the war without abandoning honor. But Vietnam was not the only battlefield. I saw the greater board, the larger struggle, the Cold War itself. Two giants locked in a stalemate, each armed with enough fire to end civilization. The Soviet Union on one side, unyielding, relentless. China on the other, vast and rising yet isolated, shunned by the world. For decades, no American president had dared to breach that wall. But I believed that if I could open that door, if I could turn China from an enemy into a partner, even briefly, the entire balance of the Cold War would shift. So I sent my trusted aide, Henry Kissinger, on secret missions, slipping through shadows, laying the groundwork for a move no one expected. When at last I flew to Beijing, when I stepped off the plane and extended my hand to Zhou Enlai, the world gasped. Cameras flashed, headlines roared, and suddenly the man once dismissed as finished was standing at the center of history. I remember the feel of Zhou's hand in mine, firm, steady, the moment heavy with symbolism. I had broken through decades of hostility with a single gesture. And in that moment, I felt a surge unlike any other. The sense that I had not only reclaimed my place, but carved it into stone. The meetings with Mao were strange, filled with pauses, silences, riddles wrapped in philosophy. He was frail, his words drifting like smoke, but his presence carried centuries of history. I listened, I nodded, I spoke carefully, knowing that every sentence would echo through time. It was not just about China, it was about Russia, about showing the Soviets that America had options, that we were not locked in one rivalry but could shift the balance with a handshake. The trip was theater, yes, but also strategy, and it worked. The world tilted, and for once it tilted in my favor. From Beijing, I moved to Moscow, where I signed agreements with Brezhnev that eased the fever of the arms race. Détente, they called it, the easing of tension, the first steps towards sanity in a world addicted to brinkmanship. We signed the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, SALT, and for a moment, the endless nightmare of nuclear escalation seemed to pause. Critics said I gave too much, that the Soviets would cheat, that détente was illusion. Perhaps it was. But in that moment, the world breathed easier, and I could feel the weight of history pressing a little lighter on my shoulders. I watched the press write of these triumphs, watched my approval climb, listened to the applause as I returned home. For a man who had been mocked, dismissed, humiliated, these were vindications sweeter than any before. I had opened China. I had faced the Soviets. I had begun to end a war. No longer just a survivor. I was a statesman, a strategist, a president who had reshaped the world order. For the first time, I thought perhaps the sneers would fade, the whispers quiet, the caricature dissolve. But even in triumph, the shadows lingered. I could not silence the inner voice that reminded me of every insult, every headline, every slight. Enemies still circled, critics still sharpened their knives. The paranoia that had followed me since boyhood remained, whispering that even now, even in victory, they were waiting. Perhaps that is why I pushed harder, grasped tighter, refused to trust. For I knew the pattern of my life too well. Every climb was followed by a fall. And though the heights I had reached were dazzling, the depths waiting below grew darker by the day. So I stood at the peak, the grocer's son who had shaken hands with emperors, who had opened doors no one else dared touch, who had carved his name into the stone of history. Yet even as I savored it, I felt the ground shifting beneath me, faint at first but steady. The storm was coming, hidden in the shadows of a hotel in Washington. whispered in the corridors of power, carried on the tapes I thought would protect me. My foreign triumphs shone brightly, but already the darkness of Watergate was gathering, waiting for its moment to strike. The Oval Office was more than a room, it was a crucible. Every decision I made reverberated across the world, every word weighed by allies and enemies alike. From the moment I sat behind that desk, I knew that foreign policy would be my stage, the place where I could shape not only the destiny of my nation, but the balance of the entire world. Domestic battles consumed presidents, but foreign policy could elevate them to history. I had studied it all my life, obsessed over strategies, rivalries, the long arc of power. Now, at last, I could act. Vietnam was the wound that would not heal, the war that divided families, poisoned politics, and stained every conversation. I had promised peace, but not surrender. Peace with honor. I repeated the phrase until it became almost a prayer. Behind closed doors, I searched for a path that would bring American boys home while still preserving the credibility of our commitments abroad. The generals urged escalation, the doves demanded withdrawal, and every day more names were carved into the granite of memory. I carried those names in silence, knowing that each belonged to a son, a brother, a husband who would never return. I pursued a strategy not of victory but of endurance. Vietnamization, they called it, handing the war back to the South Vietnamese, training them to fight their own battle while our troops stepped back. It was a slow bleed, not the clean cut the nation demanded. Critics mocked me, protesters screamed, mothers held up photographs of their lost children. I listened, but I did not bend. History, I believed, would judge endurance more kindly than surrender. At night, when the shouts of demonstrators echoed outside the White House gates, I told myself that one day the truth would be clear, that I had ended the war without abandoning honor. But Vietnam was not the only battlefield. I saw the greater board, the larger struggle, the Cold War itself. Two giants locked in a stalemate, each armed with enough fire to end civilization. The Soviet Union on one side, unyielding, relentless. China on the other, vast and rising, yet isolated, shunned by the world. For decades, no American president had dared to breach that wall. But I believed that if I could open that door, if I could turn China from an enemy into a partner, even briefly, the entire balance of the Cold War would shift. So I sent my trusted aide, Henry Kissinger, on secret missions, slipping through shadows, laying the groundwork for a move no one expected. When at last I flew to Beijing, when I stepped off the plane and extended my hand to Zhou Enlai, the world gasped. Cameras flashed, headlines roared, and suddenly the man once dismissed as finished was standing at the center of history. I remember the feel of Zhou's hand in mine, firm, steady, the moment heavy with symbolism. I had broken through decades of hostility with a single gesture, and in that moment, I felt a surge unlike any other, the sense that I had not only reclaimed my place but carved it into stone. The meetings with Mao were strange, filled with pauses, silences, riddles wrapped in philosophy. He was frail, his words drifting like smoke, but his presence carried centuries of history. I listened, I nodded, I spoke carefully, knowing that every sentence would echo through time. It was not just about China. It was about Russia, about showing the Soviets that America had options, that we were not locked in one rivalry, but could shift the balance with a handshake. The trip was theater, yes, but also strategy, and it worked. The world tilted, and for once, it tilted in my favor. From Beijing, I moved to Moscow, where I signed agreements with Brezhnev that eased the fever of the arms race. Détente, they called it, the easing of tension, the first steps towards sanity in a world addicted to brinkmanship. We signed the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, SALT, and for a moment the endless nightmare of nuclear escalation seemed to pause. Critics said I gave too much, that the Soviets would cheat, that détente was illusion. Perhaps it was, but in that moment the world breathed easier, and I could feel the weight of history pressing a little lighter on my shoulders. I watched the press write of these triumphs, watched my approval climb, listened to the applause as I returned home. For a man who had been mocked, dismissed, humiliated, these were vindications sweeter than any before. I had opened China. I had faced the Soviets. I had begun to end a war. No longer just a survivor, I was a statesman, a strategist, a president who had reshaped the world order. For the first time, I thought perhaps the sneers would fade, the whispers quiet, the caricature dissolve. But even in triumph, the shadows lingered. I could not silence the inner voice that reminded me of every insult, every headline, every slight. Enemies still circled, critics still sharpened their knives. The paranoia that had followed me since boyhood remained, whispering that even now, even in victory, they were waiting. Perhaps that is why I pushed harder, grasped tighter, refused to trust. For I knew the pattern of my life too well. Every climb was followed by a fall. And though the heights I had reached were dazzling, the depths waiting below grew darker by the day. So I stood at the peak, the grocer's son who had shaken hands with emperors, who had opened doors no one else dared touch, who had carved his name into the stone of history. Yet, even as I savored it, I felt the ground shifting beneath me, faint at first, but steady. The storm was coming, hidden in the shadows of a hotel in Washington, whispered in the corridors of power, carried on the tapes I thought would protect me. My foreign triumphs shone brightly, but already the darkness of Watergate was gathering, waiting for its moment to strike. Victory abroad had not quieted the unrest at home. Even as I returned from China to the applause of the world, the streets of America seethed with anger, distrust, and division. Vietnam still lingered like a wound that would not close. Protests erupted on college campuses, the air thick with chants against me, against the war, against everything I represented. The press printed stories dripping with contempt, eager to paint me not as a statesman, but as a liar, a schemer, a man unworthy of the office I held. I told myself it was politics, nothing more. But deep inside, the whispers of paranoia that had followed me all my life grew louder, insistent, unrelenting. I began to see enemies everywhere. Some real, some imagined, all dangerous in my eyes. Advisors encouraged me, feeding my suspicion, confirming what I already believed, that there were those within government, within the press, within the very walls of the White House who wished to destroy me. And so I built walls of my own, not of stone, but of surveillance, lists, files, secrets. The enemies list, they called it later, with mockery. But to me it was survival, a ledger of those who sought my downfall, names I could not afford to forget. Every leak from within my administration felt like a dagger. Confidential information spilled into headlines, private conversations twisted into scandal. I demanded loyalty, absolute, unquestioning, but even among my closest aides, I sensed betrayal. Meetings stretched late into the night, plans whispered in secrecy, the hum of tape recorders capturing every word in the Oval Office. At first, I told myself the recordings were protection, a shield against those who would twist my words. But the tapes would become chains, binding me to my own paranoia, my own voice the instrument of my undoing. The economy, too, conspired against me. Inflation rose, the dollar faltered, the nation uneasy. I knew drastic action was needed, and in 1971 I took a step no president had dared before. I suspended the dollar's convertibility into gold. The world gasped. The end of Bretton Woods. The end of the gold standard. Critics screamed that I had shattered the stability of global finance. But I told the nation it was strength, that America would control its destiny, that no longer would foreign governments drain our reserves. It was a bold move, born not only of calculation, but of the old mixture of brilliance and fear. The Nixon shock, they called it. And though it carried risks, it gave me the control I craved. Yet control was always fleeting. The more I grasped, the more it slipped through my fingers. The protesters grew louder, the press more hostile, the opposition more determined. I watched the polls, the headlines, the faces of my advisors, searching for signs of loyalty or betrayal. I withdrew deeper into the fortress of my mind, convinced that the world was aligned against me, that only I could see the truth. I was not entirely wrong. Enemies did circle, knives did gleam, but I magnified them, fed them, allowed them to shape my every move until suspicion became obsession. In public, I still smiled, still shook hands, still spoke of peace and progress. But in private, I paced the halls of the White House at night, curtains drawn, the glow of the lamps spilling over papers filled with names, strategies, counterattacks. I was fighting not only wars abroad, but wars within my own mind, wars against shadows that grew larger with every passing day. I told myself that greatness demanded vigilance, that leadership required toughness, that history would vindicate me. But even then, in the quiet moments, I felt the weight of something darker pressing in, the sense that my hunger for control, my mistrust of others, my need to silence every critic was pulling me toward a reckoning I could not escape. The shadows lengthened, and though the applause of foreign triumphs still echoed faintly, the drumbeat of scandal had already begun, faint but steady, marking the path toward my fall. It began, as many catastrophes do, as something small and stupid, a late-night whisper that seemed at the time merely a nuisance, not the hinge on which an entire presidency would swing. We had enemies, of course. The world is full of them, and I had learned to catalogue them, to mark their habits, to measure their reach. But when a handful of men, drunk on a false sense of mission, slipped into a building to steal papers and plant listening devices, I told myself this would be contained. A third-rate burglary, the newspapers would call it, and then it would pass. How naive I was to think that any wound could be sealed by calm words and quick fixes. At first, it truly looked like a nuisance. The burglars were clumsy, the security men competent, and the reporters smelled blood, but could not yet see the full body. I remember the first meetings not as conspiratorial councils, but as urgent, practical sessions. Damage control, deniability, quiet payments to stop mouths from wagging. We tried to paint it as the work of local thugs, a police matter, nothing presidential. I told myself that discretion and prudence would be our salvation, that a steady hand could close the breach before it widened. That hand, it turned out, belonged to the very man who had taught me to distrust the world, me. Paranoia, which had always been a companion at the edges of my life, crept forward and sat at the center of everything. I began to see the break-in not as isolated malfeasance, but as evidence of a conspiracy stretching through subterranean channels. Enemies in the press, in the party, hidden leaks inside my own administration. Each new revelation felt like a fresh knife, another aide implicated, another correspondent with a dubious source, another congressman whispering of impeachment in corridors. I tried to staunch the flow with loyalty tests and whisper campaigns, with the offering of small favors and larger denials, but each action braided us tighter into the very net I hoped to escape. We chose secrecy because we feared exposure. At the time, that fear felt rational. The stakes were enormous: political survival, credibility in an age of crisis, the ability to continue the work I believed only I could finish. So I authorized moves I would later regret. Payments to secure silence, instructions to impede certain investigations, a language of obfuscation that I told myself was temporary, practical, necessary. In quieter moments, though, a cold doubt settled. Was I protecting the nation or protecting my own skin? The line blurred until protection and self-preservation were indistinguishable. Then came the tapes. The Oval Office, that room of portraits and heavy curtains, had been my refuge for decades, the place where I could speak plainly, knowing the words were safe in the ear of history. We had installed recording devices out of a desire to preserve memory, to have an unvarnished record of decisions, in an age when memory is slippery and witnesses unreliable. At the time, the idea seemed prudent, perhaps even wise, a safeguard against the rewriting of events. Who could have predicted the irony that those same tapes would fashion the rope that would hang me? Listening to those recordings later, I heard versions of myself I would rather not have known. There was calculation, yes, and firmness, but there was also anger, moments of vindictive humor, sarcasm that allowed hostility to taste like policy. My voice, which I had relied upon for decades to persuade and console, betrayed me by being indisputably me. Each phrase, each grumble, became evidence of intent. Each hesitant pause could be framed as proof of premeditation. I had sought to create an impartial archive. Instead, I had left behind the clearest, most damning portrait of my own thinking. As the investigation deepened, the House began to circle. Televised hearings, subpoenas, slow revelations that fattened into a story the country could not turn away from. Men I had trusted whispered in public and then in back rooms, until the betrayal felt like betrayal by the very air. Friends resigned, aides pleaded the fifth, and the press, which I had long seen as an enemy and an opportunist, moved from curiosity to crusade. The tapes were ordered. I stalled, I negotiated. I sought to limit the damage, to argue for privilege, for the sanctity of presidential communications. Each delay, each argument only made suspicion keener. Despite my efforts to contain it, the truth has an appetite of its own. As the House Judiciary Committee edged toward articles of impeachment, the country divided again, not unlike those earlier years when war and protest sundered us. Some stood by me, loyal to the end, convinced I was being felled by political vengeance. Others saw in my actions the arrogance, the abuse of power, the moral failing no office could justify. I felt both the love and the hatred, the loyalty and the contempt, a duality that had marked my whole life. It was painful and illuminating. In quieter hours, removed from the noise and the cameras, I replayed the decisions that had brought me here. I thought of the small compromises, the initial rationalizations that had seemed harmless at the time. One payment to silence, one misdirection, a whispered instruction to delay. Each had felt tactical, temporary, surgical. Taken together, they formed a pattern of self-preservation that looked from the outside like a system of deceit. I asked myself whether ambition had become so ferocious that it devoured restraint. Had the hunger that had driven me from Yorba Linda to the White House turned predatory? I did not know. I only knew the machine I had set in motion would not stop for regret. When the recordings were finally subpoenaed, my world narrowed to the sound of my own voice. I listened as the public did, but from inside the storm where every inflection bore weight. I began to understand that the very tools I had used to protect myself had become the instruments of my downfall. Those tapes, meant to guard history, would not be edited to fit a narrative flattering to me. They would be presented raw, and in the rawness, my justifications and my tempers would be unforgivingly exposed. There is a peculiar loneliness to public disgrace. The crowds that once cheered now held placards demanding accountability. The columns that once praised now dissected motive and method. When allies left me, it was not always out of malice. Some departed to save their own reputations, others because the calculus of loyalty had shifted. A presidency survives on coalitions, on patience, on the ability to forge agreements that trade away nothing essential. Watergate took that away, and in doing so it revealed how much of political life rests on trust that, when broken, is hard to rebuild. Eventually, inevitability took the stage. The tapes once fought for were released in part. The country heard the evidence with its own ears. The House moved forward. I remember the day the phone stopped ringing with warm words of support and started ringing with counsel to consider the unthinkable. Advisors spoke in hushed tones of resignation, of the cost of continuing the fight for a presidency consumed by scandal. For a man who had defined himself by endurance, the idea of stepping down felt like the last of the defeats. But endurance without purpose is merely stubbornness, and sometimes the brave thing is to choose the path that spares the nation further pain. When I finally announced my decision, I felt a grief that was not only personal, but civic. I had come to the office to serve, to shape the world toward what I believed was prudent and stable. I had opened doors to China, negotiated arms deals that cooled a fever of annihilation, and tried to end a war in a manner I thought honorable. Yet all of that was eclipsed by the simple, brutal arithmetic of scandal. The country needed healing more than it needed my ego preserved. That realization did not make the choice easier. It made it necessary. In the end, Watergate was a lesson in humility writ large. It taught me that power without restraint is a dangerous thing, that secrecy can become a prison, that the means will forever stain the ends if they are corrupt. I had let suspicion become strategy, and in doing so I had eroded the very trust that undergirds democratic life. If there is a final confession here, it is that ambition, left unchecked by conscience and tempered judgment, corrodes the soul of a leader, and by extension, the society he serves. And so the chapter closed, not with a triumphant flourish but with a small private resignation. A recognition that some costs are too great to inflict on a nation for the sake of one man's survival. The tapes would remain in the record, the hearings would remain in films and books, and my name would be forever linked to both achievement and disgrace. Sleep on that with me, if you will. The paradox that a life can contain great deeds and terrible errors at once, and that history, in its slow way, will judge both with a mercy that is rarely instantaneous. The walls of the White House seemed to close in as the days shortened and the evidence mounted. I had once walked those halls with pride, feeling the weight of history as an ally, but by the summer of 1974, history had turned its gaze upon me with cold judgment. The laughter of aides, once easy and frequent, grew hushed. The corridors echoed with whispers instead of plans. Every knock at the door carried dread. Another resignation, another betrayal, another step closer to the inevitable. I watched men I had trusted fall away one by one. Haldeman, Ehrlichman, men who had been my shield and my sword, gone. Some to prison, others to disgrace, all leaving me with the bitter taste of abandonment. They had shared my victories, feasted on the spoils of power, but when the tide turned, their loyalty dissolved. I tried to tell myself that I still had allies, still had friends in Congress, but each day brought new messages, new warnings. The votes for impeachment were aligning. The Senate would not acquit, and the base of support I had built brick by brick was crumbling beneath me. I felt anger, sharp and consuming. How could they not see what I had accomplished? I had opened the doors to China, negotiated with the Soviets, begun to end a war that had drained our nation for years. Was I to be remembered not for the statesmanship, the triumphs, but for a burglary and the whispers that followed? My voice grew harsh, my tone bitter. In private, I lashed out at those who remained, railing against the unfairness, the hypocrisy, the vultures who circled overhead. But when the anger subsided, I was left only with the silence of despair. Sleep became a stranger. I wandered the White House at night, the glow of lamps spilling across the portraits of presidents who had faced their own trials. I looked into their painted eyes and asked questions they could not answer. Was I truly undone by my own flaws, or by the relentless hunger of enemies who had waited for my misstep? The truth, I knew, was both. My paranoia had become prophecy, my fear of betrayal a self-fulfilling spiral. I had built walls to protect myself, and in doing so, had trapped myself within them. By August, the calls became unbearable. Senators, once polite, now blunt. The votes for conviction were certain. Members of my own party urged me to resign, not for my sake, but for theirs, for the survival of what we had built. The image of impeachment loomed, the shame of a trial broadcast to the world, my name etched forever as the first president removed from office. To resign was humiliation. To stay was catastrophe. I weighed the options until the scales no longer mattered. On the night of August 8, 1974, I sat before the cameras and told the nation that I would resign the presidency effective at noon the following day. The words tasted like ash in my mouth. I had fought my whole life to climb, to endure, to survive, and now I was stepping down not by choice but by necessity. I spoke of unity, of healing, of the need for America to move forward. But beneath those words was a grief too heavy to disguise. I was not merely leaving an office. I was leaving behind the very identity that had defined me since boyhood. The morning of August 9th, I rose early. The air was thick with sorrow, though the sun shone as though nothing had changed. I walked through the rooms one last time, the walls heavy with memory. I said farewell to the staff, to the Secret Service agents who had watched over me, to the faces who had served faithfully, even as the world turned against me. I tried to hold myself upright, to offer them the dignity of a man unbroken, but inside, I felt the collapse of decades of ambition. When the time came, I stepped onto the south lawn, Pat by my side, my daughters close behind. The helicopter waited, blades turning, the sound like a relentless drum. I turned to the crowd gathered below, lifted my hands in that familiar gesture, the double V for victory sign. It was a strange defiance, a final mask of triumph at the moment of utter defeat. Some cheered, some wept, some simply watched in silence. I smiled, though it was the smile of a man saying goodbye to everything he had fought for. As the helicopter lifted off, I looked down at the White House shrinking beneath me, the city spreading out, the nation I had served and scarred stretching to the horizon. I thought of Yorba Linda, of the dusty roads of my youth, of the boy who had dreamed of this very place. That boy had climbed, had endured, had reached the pinnacle, only to fall. The bitterness was sharp, but beneath it, a strange calm began to settle. The fight was over. The climb had ended. The name Richard Nixon would be forever tied to both greatness and disgrace. And as Washington faded beneath me, I knew that whatever else history might say, it would never forget me. My victories, my failures, my paranoia, my brilliance, my resignation, all woven together into the paradox of a man who reached the highest office in the land, only to leave it in the silence of shame. There is a strange clarity that comes when the climb is over. For years I measured my worth by battles fought and victories won, by the shadows I outmaneuvered and the storms I endured. When I left the White House behind, when the helicopter lifted me from the lawn where I had once stood as master, I felt stripped bare, exposed as both conqueror and casualty. And yet, in that nakedness, I began to see myself more clearly than I ever had in power. I thought often of the contradictions that defined me. I was a man who dreamed of peace, yet prolonged war, who opened the door to China, yet closed myself within the walls of secrecy. I fought for recognition with a hunger that could never be sated, even when the world bowed its head in my direction. I believed that suspicion was survival, but suspicion became my cage. I wanted to be remembered for greatness, and instead I became the cautionary tale whispered in classrooms, in newsrooms, in the corridors of government. And still, even in disgrace, I found fragments of redemption. The world did not erase my achievements. The handshake with Zhou Enlai still echoes, the treaties with Brezhnev still matter, the steps toward ending the war are still counted in the slow march of history. Leaders called on me, seeking counsel not from a saint, but from a survivor. Perhaps that was always my truest role, not the shining figure of Camelot, not the darling of television screens, but the flawed man who had clawed his way up from dust, endured humiliation, and still had something to teach. In my later years, as I wrote and spoke and traveled, I came to accept that history does not grant simple verdicts. It layers triumph with failure, brilliance with paranoia, nobility with shame. I embodied all of these, and perhaps that is why my story continues to be told. Not because it is clean, but because it is complicated. And complication is what makes us human. To you who listen in the stillness of night, I offer this. Do not imagine power as a prize without cost. Every victory leaves scars. Every ascent creates shadows. Every act of control tempts corruption. If my life has meaning beyond its paradoxes, it is this: that ambition without reflection devours, that suspicion without trust corrodes, that greatness without humility collapses under its own weight. I was Richard Nixon. I was the boy from Yorba Linda who dreamed of escape. I was the president who opened doors and closed others. I was a man who reached the summit and resigned in shame. I was both the promise and the warning. And now, as the night gathers around you, as my voice fades into quiet, let my story rest with you, not as judgment, but as reminder. That even in our flaws, even in our falls, there are lessons worth carrying. Breathe deeply. Let the noise of scandal and triumph drift into the distance. The world moves on, as it always does, but the story remains, tucked away in memory, to be recalled when you need to remember that even power bends, even giants stumble, even the highest office is held by fragile men. And in that remembering, perhaps you will find peace enough to sleep,